The night air was sharp, tinged with the smell of rain and exhaust. My coat was old, threadbare at the seams, but I didn't care. I chose it carefully, the one that made me look ordinary, maybe even a little pitiable. Not the kind of girl you'd imagine could command power or wealth. Not the kind of girl his family would ever suspect could be more than they expected. I had rehearsed every step, every word, every gesture, in the mirror. I practiced tilting my head just right, softening my voice, making my hands look small and uncertain. I wanted them to think I was harmless, easily overlooked. It was almost laughable. The lengths I went to perform humility. Yet I knew why I did it. I had to see what kind of people they truly were, not the polished, smiling facade they offered to the world, but the real, calculating hearts behind the dinner table. The driveway was perfectly lit, a soft golden glow illuminating the cobblestones. I could see the house in the distance, large, imposing, every window reflecting the lights of carefully curated interiors. Inside, I imagined crystal glasses, polished silverware, and the quiet, cutting assessment of eyes that weighed every detail. My heart didn't race. I wasn't afraid, at least not of them. I was excited to uncover truth, to watch the mechanics of power at work. When I rang the doorbell, his mother answered almost immediately. Her smile was wide, teeth perfect, but it didn't reach her eyes. She looked me over slowly, the kind of look that measured not my beauty but my worth. She tilted her head ever so slightly, like she was assessing the fabric of my coat, the length of my sleeves, the cleanliness of my nails. Every small detail mattered. "This is her," she asked, not to me, but to him. The words were simple, but the tone carried a judgment I couldn't ignore. I smiled politely. "Yes, that's me." She nodded once and stepped aside. The door clicked shut behind me, and I stepped into the warmth of the house. The interior was as I had imagined, opulent, tasteful yet sterile, almost as if it had been arranged for evaluation rather than comfort. A chandelier hung low over the dining table, crystal glasses catching the light in tiny bursts, silverware so heavy it felt like it belonged to a museum. His father sat at the head of the table, motionless, the way a king might observe a visitor. His sister reclined in her chair, arms crossed, her gaze sharp. His mother moved to fill the chairs, her smile still in place, but more controlled now, like a mask she was practiced in wearing. And then there was me, walking into this room, a carefully rehearsed naive girl. I lowered myself into the chair, placing my hands neatly in my lap. My fingers were trembling ever so slightly, but I made sure it wasn't visible. Every movement was calculated, every breath measured, because I didn't just want to survive this dinner. I wanted to understand, to observe, to gather information. The conversation started innocuously enough. "How was your trip?" his mother asked. The words smooth, polite, but I could hear the underlying intention. It wasn't a casual question, it was a probe. I smiled softly. "It was fine. Thank you, a little tiring but lovely." There was a pause, a tilt of the head from his sister, her lips pressing together in a thin line. Her eyes flickered to my coat, my shoes. I could feel the silent calculations, the measurements of worth, the inventorying of status. I didn't flinch, I didn't need to. His father spoke next, a calm, deliberate voice. "We're glad you could join us." But it wasn't warmth, it was assessment. Like the sentence itself carried weight, not of kindness, but of judgment. I nodded politely. "Thank you for having me." Dinner progressed slowly. Every dish was meticulously served, each plate a subtle statement of wealth and sophistication. The bread basket was passed around. I reached for a slice, careful to keep my hands small. Modest, his mother's eyes followed me, scrutinizing every detail. "No ring yet," she asked softly. "Smart, these things are expensive." I laughed lightly, a sound that was slightly nervous, slightly rehearsed. "Yes, it seems that way." I said innocuous, harmless, acceptable. But the trap was already set. Their words, their glances, every smile. It was all part of an invisible test, a measuring of how much I could endure, how much I could be underestimated. His sister leaned in, voice sweet but sharp. "So, what do you do exactly?" I froze for half a heartbeat, then gave a vague answer. "I help with online things, harmless, ambiguous, enough to suggest modesty, but not enough to reveal the truth." "Oh," she said, the words stretching, dripping with skepticism. "So, not very stable." The table seemed to close in around me. The word landed heavier than any insult. Stability, or the lack of it. A single word, loaded with assumption. My fiance shifted next to me. Surely, he would defend me. Surely, he would say something. But he didn't. His silence was louder than the accusation. His mother refilled everyone's glasses, everyone but mine. "You wouldn't appreciate this one anyway," she said gently, almost kindly. The words were sugar-coated, but they stung with the implication that I was beneath their attention, undeserving of their finest things. I nodded, pretending to agree, pretending I didn't notice the exclusion. The subtle power plays, the invisible barriers erected against me. They talked over me for the next several minutes. Investments, vacations, the kind of casual name-dropping that signals privilege and tests the awareness of outsiders. Each word, each phrase, each subtle glance chipped away at the persona they assumed I had. And I let it. Because this wasn't about me being liked. It was about watching, observing, understanding the dynamics of this family, and what they considered important. The grandmother didn't speak, she didn't intervene. She watched. Her silence carried more weight than all their words combined. Her gaze was quiet but heavy, absorbing every micro-expression, every small act of deference and compliance. She was the only person whose eyes didn't try to measure my worth. Instead, they seemed to study something deeper: my intentions, my spirit, my patience. By the time dessert was suggested, I knew something crucial. This dinner wasn't about introductions. It wasn't about pleasantries. It was a test, a measuring of character, poise and perceived value. Every glance, every word, every pause was a question, a probe into who I was and how much I would submit. And I didn't know it yet, but I had already decided. I would not fail their test, not in the way they expected, not in a way that allowed them to see my true strength, yet. For tonight, I would play the part. The naive girl, the harmless, pliable figure, the one they could underestimate. But beneath the quiet smiles and soft laughter, I was calculating, observing, preparing, because before the night was over, I would see the cracks in their armor, and they would see the truth in mine. The first insult arrived like a whisper, soft enough to almost miss, but precise enough to cut. It didn't come from his father, or the sister, or even the mother directly. It came from the air itself, thick with expectation, judgment, and carefully veiled superiority. I reached for the bread basket, careful to keep my hands small and unassuming. His mother's eyes followed me, sharp and evaluating. "No ring yet?" she asked, her voice soft, measured, like a teacher correcting a student. "Smart, these things are expensive." I laughed lightly, just enough to seem timid and grateful. Yes, it seems that way. Innocuous, harmless, the kind of answer that could not offend. But the slight curl of her lips didn't reach her eyes. The words, though soft, were meant to remind me of my place. His sister leaned back in her chair, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes scanning my every move. "So, what do you do exactly?" she asked. Not what is your job, not how do you spend your days, but what exactly. The tone carried expectation, as if she already knew the answer should be small, unthreatening. "I help with online things," I said softly, deliberately vague. A small pause followed, the kind that tests confidence. "Oh," her voice stretched the word thin. "So, not very stable." The table seemed to close in around me. Stability, a single word, but it carried centuries of assumed social hierarchy. My hands tightened in my lap, fingers pressing into one another. My fiance shifted beside me, looking uncomfortable, but he said nothing. His silence was louder than any accusation. His mother poured wine for the adults around the table, deliberately skipping my glass. "You wouldn't appreciate this one anyway," she said, her voice smooth and sweet. But the implication stung. I smiled politely, nodding, careful not to betray the tiniest flicker of awareness. The conversation resumed, but now with a sharper edge. They spoke about vacations, exotic, curated trips only people of privilege could afford. They spoke about investments, casually throwing around figures that would make my heart race if anyone truly knew my earnings. Yet I remained composed, listening, absorbing, calculating. Then came the subtle challenge. His father leaned back, voice calm but heavy with scrutiny. "Marriage is a partnership," he said. "It's not just about love." I nodded, of course, small words, carefully measured. The wrong word could tilt the balance. His sister, ever observant, leaned forward slightly. "So, what exactly do you bring to this family?" Her voice was soft, like sugar laced with poison. All eyes now fixed on me. I held their gaze briefly, the silence stretching deliberately. "I bring loyalty," I said, voice gentle, measured, the kind that doesn't make noise. A laugh, short and sharp, came from the sister. "That doesn't pay bills," she said, with the sweet precision of someone trying to demean, without appearing cruel. The grandmother, who had not spoken the entire evening, shifted slightly, eyes flicking toward the sister, a silent warning. Her gaze was quiet but authoritative, and in that moment, I realized she was the only person at the table who wasn't trying to dominate, control, or belittle. She was observing, truly observing. The mother interjected smoothly, like a mediator who has been rehearsed in her role. Ambition can be intimidating, she said, almost conversationally, but the sharp undertone was unmistakable. The words flowed over me like a current, pushing me towards some internal line I had already decided I wouldn't cross. I smiled, nodded, agreed where necessary, played the part they expected. And yet, beneath the surface, I was not naive. I was watching them, every glance, every tilt of the head, every micro-expression. I noted the slight tightening of the father's jaw when I spoke of independence, the soft glance of the grandmother when subtle cruelty was attempted. She noticed, even when the others pretended not to. The conversation twisted, turning to charitable works, personal habits, social circles, each a subtle probe into my background, my values, my supposed worth. Each question, each statement, was a test of how far I would bend, how far I would yield to their expectations. The sister smiled again, this time with a sharper edge. "Be honest," she said softly. "You're not with him for security, are you?" The words could have shattered me if I let them. But I didn't. I lowered my gaze, maintaining the soft, demure posture I had practiced. "No," I whispered. "I just want a simple life." Her lips pressed into a thin line. The mother's fingers twitched against the tablecloth. The father nodded ever so slightly, seemingly satisfied with my compliance. Yet I could see through their facade, the underlying calculation, the way they evaluated and catalogued me as if I were an object under inspection. I understood then the danger of this dinner. It was never about introductions, manners, or politeness. It was a power test, a silent war waged with smiles and soft words. And while they believed they were testing me, I realized I was testing them, too, observing their values, their priorities, their weaknesses. The grandmother's eyes lingered on me. Patient, perceptive, she did not speak. She did not intervene, but her attention was sharper than any question, any glance, any pointed comment from the rest of the family. She measured, weighed, and judged not my appearance or my assumed wealth, but my spirit, my patience, my resilience. And I waited, patiently, calmly, smiling, nodding, soft, obedient, yet fully aware of the power dynamics at play. By the time dessert was mentioned, I knew one thing clearly. This dinner wasn't about me fitting in. It was about their perception of value, about seeing how I would behave under scrutiny, and how I would allow them to define me. And I had made my decision. I would not fail their test, not in the way they imagined, not in a way that exposed the truth too soon. I would let them think they understood me. I would let them underestimate me. Because tomorrow, when the time was right, they would see the truth, and the impact would be far beyond their expectations. The air was thick with pretense, but beneath it, the currents of calculation and observation ran deep. Every gesture, every smile, every polite acknowledgement was part of the intricate game. And I was ready to play, not to lose, but to understand, to learn, and eventually to win. I felt it before I saw it, the subtle shift in the room, almost imperceptible, like a whisper of wind through a heavy curtain. The moment when curiosity replaced cruelty, when calculation faltered just enough to expose something real. It was the grandmother. She hadn't spoken once during the entire dinner. Her hands rested neatly on the table, fingers interlaced, posture perfect. But her eyes, those quiet, observant eyes, had never left me. Not once. Unlike the others, she didn't scan for wealth, status, or obedience. She wasn't weighing me. She was measuring something else: integrity, patience, the silent strength that refuses to bow. While the rest of the family awaited my response, I realized she was the only one truly present in the moment. Her silence carried more gravity than any sentence the mother, father, or sister had delivered. There was an unspoken understanding in her gaze, a recognition that the surface she presented to the world, the polished manners, the sharp judgments, was merely a performance, and she could see beyond it. I straightened my posture slightly, trying to project calm, demure simplicity. "I bring loyalty," I said finally, my voice soft yet deliberate, the kind that doesn't make noise. There was a pause, long enough for her to tilt her head slightly, to study me, but not enough for anyone else to understand its significance. His sister laughed quietly, her tone laced with condescension. "That doesn't pay bills." The words, though light, cut sharply through the polite veneer of the dinner. I felt them, but I remained composed. I allowed the sentence to hang in the air, unacknowledged, except by those who truly understood its weight. The grandmother's eyes flicked toward her granddaughter, a mere glance. but it stopped her smile from widening. Then, without looking away from me, she exhaled softly, as though releasing the tension she alone could sense. His mother tried to recover the flow of conversation, speaking smoothly about ambition and intimidation. Ambition can be intimidating, she said, her voice calm, practiced. But her words lacked the weight they had intended. They were starting to falter under the scrutiny of someone who saw more than they assumed. My fiancé shifted beside me, unease evident, though he attempted to mask it. "Why are you making this awkward?" he whispered quietly, leaning in. His words carried a hint of defensiveness, as though he sensed the grandmother's awareness, but still chose to ignore it. I allowed a tiny smile, soft, patient, knowing I'm not making it awkward. I whispered back, "I'm simply letting truth exist." The table's energy shifted subtly. They continued speaking, but there was caution now in their tone, an unintentional hesitation. Every glance, every question, every comment was tempered by an unseen weight. The grandmother's quiet authority and the realization that perhaps they had underestimated the one they had tested so thoroughly. Then, unexpectedly, the grandmother leaned in slightly, her voice calm and even, yet cutting through the tension like a fine blade. "And fear?" she asked, her gaze meeting mine directly. "Do you fear him?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spread, affecting everyone at the table. My fiancé tensed. His mother's fingers twitched lightly against the tablecloth. The sister's nails tapped impatiently against her glass. I paused, not out of fear, but because the truth had suddenly become a delicate weapon. To speak recklessly could betray everything I had carefully concealed. "I fear disappointment," I said quietly, and silence. The room's energy shifted again. The grandmother's gaze softened ever so slightly, approving, acknowledging the weight of my answer. My fiancé's jaw tightened, and for the first time that night, I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, not understanding, but awareness. His mother cleared her throat, attempting to redirect the conversation. "Well, this is all very emotional. Let's remain practical," she said, a soft command disguised as civility. But the shift in the air was undeniable. The table, which had been a battlefield of subtle judgments, had been infiltrated by something they hadn't accounted for: perception beyond wealth and social performance. The grandmother nodded, sipping her water deliberately. Eyes still on me. "You can tell a lot about a family," she said quietly, "by how they treat someone who cannot benefit them." Her words were simple, yet they carried a gravity that silenced the others more effectively than any verbal confrontation could. They were polite again, nodding, smiling, but the sharp edge in their interactions had dulled. Caution replaced arrogance. The careful choreography of power had fractured. I realized then that this dinner had never been solely about me. It was about assessment, about testing, about understanding. But beneath their words and subtle manipulations, I had discovered the currents that governed this family: pride, control, perception, and fear. And I had already begun to understand the grandmother's role in it all. She had been silent, unjudging. Observing, she had been waiting. Watching, measuring. Not me, not the family, but the balance of power. The integrity of the young woman who dared to appear small in a room full of judgment. By the time dessert was served, I understood the unspoken rule of the evening. The grandmother was not merely a participant. She was the unseen judge, the subtle arbiter of truth, and the only person who saw the real me. I left the table that night calm, composed, yet fully aware of the subtle shift. The others might have believed themselves in control, assessing, judging, calculating my worth. But one person had already seen the truth, and that truth would become my strongest ally in the coming days. As I walked to the door later that evening, I felt her gaze follow me. No words were exchanged, but I knew she had chosen to trust in me, to acknowledge my strength quietly. And in that quiet acknowledgement lay hope, the kind that could shift power, realign influence, and set the stage for everything that would follow. That night, I didn't just survive the dinner. I observed, I learned, and I understood. For the first time, that power in that house did not lie in titles, wealth, or appearances. It lay in perception, patience, and the quiet authority that the grandmother wielded effortlessly. And one day, I would wield my own authority just as quietly, but far more decisively. Dessert hadn't yet been touched when the conversation took a sharper edge. His father, sitting with his back perfectly straight, polished his fork thoughtfully, then laid it down with deliberate precision. "Let's discuss logistics," he said calmly, the weight of his tone revealing the unspoken meaning beneath the words. Marriage is a partnership. I had anticipated this, every subtle glance, Every loaded sentence had led to this point. They were not curious about me. They were evaluating, measuring, categorizing, and I would let them for now. He fixed his gaze on me for the first time. Piercing, calculating. Do you have savings? It wasn't a question of curiosity. It was an inspection, a test. A single sentence designed to evaluate worth, stability, and potential threat. I have a little, I said softly, almost as if admitting too much would betray my role. His sister's lips curved into a controlled, patronizing smile. That's not an answer, she said, voice silk covering steel. His mother's hand lingered on her glass, adjusting the napkin with precision. We only want to ensure that you will not overly depend on our son. He has potential, she said carefully, the emphasis on potential, like a dagger wrapped in velvet. Potential, I understood immediately. A word rich families use when inheritance and social hierarchy are already guaranteed. Potential meant calculated growth, protection, expectation, and warning. My fiancé nodded, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent. That was the part that hurt the most. Traditional roles are important. His father continued, voice unwavering. A woman supports, a man provides. I leaned slightly forward, voice soft, eyes steady, and if the woman can provide too. The silence was immediate, tangible, like the air had thickened around us. His mother's smile stiffened. Ambition can be intimidating, she said carefully, her words meant to warn rather than praise. Then came the pivotal moment. His sister leaned in, tilting her head, nails tapping the rim of her glass. Be honest, she said quietly. You're not with him for security, are you? Each word was measured, calculated. A psychological scalpel aimed at testing boundaries. I lowered my gaze, softly, demurely. No, I whispered. I just want a simple life. Her smile faltered. The mother's fingers pressed lightly into the tablecloth. The father nodded as if pleased. Yet I could see through the carefully constructed veneer. They were attempting to catalog me, to assign value based on my apparent lack of wealth. Then he said it, the line that confirmed everything I had feared and predicted. If things ever get difficult, the father said casually, you should know we don't support financial mistakes. Mistakes, not about love, not about kindness, not about commitment. They weren't speaking of the heart at all. They were speaking about leverage, control, and obedience. It hit me like ice water. This family did not fear poverty. They feared loss of control. They feared autonomy in a woman who dared to appear small. I continued to sit, outwardly compliant, inwardly calculating, each carefully crafted gesture, each soft smile, each nod to their expectations was a performance, a deliberate mask hiding understanding, patience, and awareness. I glanced briefly at my fiancé. His jaw tightened. His eyes flickered with something I hadn't expected, unease, confusion, uncertainty, perhaps even guilt. But he remained silent. His silence, I realized, was consent, acceptance of their method, their hierarchy, their manipulation. The grandmother remained still, her presence subtle but immense. She had not spoken, yet her eyes conveyed everything. Observation, awareness, judgment, understanding, and possibly quietly, allegiance to truth rather than pretense. As the conversation continued, I noticed patterns. They measured my responses, timing my hesitation, my soft smiles, my carefully modulated words. They tested for fear, compliance, and weakness, but they had underestimated one thing entirely: my patience, my understanding of human psychology, my awareness of their hierarchy. Every word they used to belittle or control only fed the deeper narrative I was constructing in my mind. Every glance meant something. Every calculated advice and condescending remark was cataloged and stored for future leverage. The grandmother's presence, constant and quiet, gave me a silent assurance I was not alone in perception. Her subtle nods, her measured glances, confirmed that she, at least, saw reality for what it was. By the time coffee was served, I had a complete mental map of the room. Who wielded overt control, the father and sister. Who attempted to moderate through charm and veiled instruction, the mother. Who observed quietly but held true influence, the grandmother. And my fiancé, caught somewhere between fear, inertia, and perhaps misplaced loyalty. I realized then that the most dangerous aspect of this family was not their wealth, influence, or etiquette. It was the invisible rules, the unspoken hierarchies, the tests designed to suppress autonomy. And I had decided I would continue the act of naivety for now. Allow them to underestimate me. Continue to play the part of the compliant, simple girl, but I would learn, memorize, understand every subtle cue. I would turn their assessment into my advantage. By the end of the evening, I had already begun plotting the subtle reveals, the moments where their assumptions would be challenged without mercy. They believed they had control. They believed they were the judges. But the grandmother's quiet approval suggested otherwise. There was an ally in the room who understood strength, patience, and perception, and I would rely on that alliance to navigate, survive, and ultimately expose the true dynamics of this family. The final moments of the dinner were polite, almost cheerful, but the air was heavy with unspoken tension. Every soft laugh, every subtle nod, every polite question carried weight, and I carried my observations silently, storing each for the moment when the balance of power would shift. I left the dinner with calm composure, outwardly unchanged, inwardly armed with knowledge, clarity, and determination. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of a game they did not even know they were playing, and I intended to win. I excused myself from the table before anyone could notice the subtle trembling in my hands. The hallway was quiet, dimly lit by the sconces that lined the walls, each bulb casting small pools of golden light. I pressed my palms against the cool marble of the console table, taking deep, deliberate breaths, trying to steady myself. The mirror reflected a girl I barely recognized, not the one I was pretending to be at the dinner table, not the meek, naive girl who played small to appease their expectations. No, it reflected someone sharpened, calculating, aware, someone who had absorbed every glance, every subtle remark, every veiled insult, and was silently recording it all. This was the first moment the act of humility began to feel heavy, almost too heavy to carry. Not because I feared them, I did not, but because the silence of my fiancé beside me at the table had spoken volumes. His neutrality, his refusal to defend me, had cut deeper than the sister's condescension or the father's cold judgment. The realization struck, if he could not see it now, would he ever? I leaned against the console, letting my head tilt slightly back, closing my eyes. Each insult had been intentional, a precise weapon wrapped in politeness. Every glance, every veiled comment, every slight exclusion had been a test, and I had passed it outwardly, without them realizing that they had underestimated me entirely. When I returned to the table, they tried to maintain normalcy. Soft smiles, quiet laughter, but I noticed the subtle shift. They were now cautious, careful, their words measured, their gestures controlled, the underlying judgment slightly restrained. They had begun to realize that the girl they assumed was simple, naive, and dependent was far more aware than they had guessed. Then the grandmother spoke again, softly, almost tiredly. Her voice carried a weight that silenced the entire table. "Child," she said, her gaze fixed firmly on me, "when someone asks you to shrink so they can feel tall, it's not love." The words struck like lightning. The entire room seemed to pause. The father's hand froze mid-motion over his cup. The mother's smile faltered. The sister's nails tapped slower. Almost hesitant, the grandmother continued, "Tell me, if you lost everything tomorrow, would he still choose you?" I looked at my fiancé, really looked. For the first time that night, I stopped acting entirely. His eyes avoided mine. His jaw tightened. His silence said more than any apology ever could. A quiet ache settled in my chest, not for the insults, not for the judgment, but for the truth that the person I had trusted to stand with me, to see me as I truly am, had chosen not to act. I allowed a small, controlled exhale. There would be no tears, no dramatic outburst. That wasn't the point. I had learned something far more important tonight. The measure of a person's character isn't in the words they say, but in the choices they make when others need them most. Dinner plates were cleared with soft clinks that seemed louder than usual in the thick, heavy silence. The family's polite conversation resumed, but the energy had shifted irrevocably. They were still performing, still smiling, but their control had fractured. They could sense it, even if they didn't understand why. And I made my decision. I would no longer pretend this relationship made sense. The mask I wore at the table had served its purpose. It had allowed me to observe, to understand, to assess. But the emotional cost had made one thing clear: I could not let myself be diminished any longer. I gathered my composure, smoothed my coat, and leaned back in my chair. The grandmother's eyes met mine briefly. A slight nod, subtle, almost imperceptible, acknowledged what I could not yet say aloud. She understood. She had seen everything. And in her quiet acknowledgement lay hope, the hope that I was not entirely alone, that someone in this room recognized truth, strength, and resilience. My fiancé remained beside me, silent, watching, not fully understanding the transformation that had occurred in those few hours. He had seen only the performance, not the depth beneath it, but I had seen him, or rather, his inability to act, and the clarity that emerged was undeniable. As the night drew to a close, I excused myself again, this time to the solitude of my room. I allowed the mask of humility and naivety to slip entirely. I could feel the tension, the emotional weight of every subtle remark, every exclusion, every test. It pressed against my chest, heavy, demanding attention. I sat at the edge of the bed, hands folded, thinking. Every moment at that table had been a calculation, every word a subtle power play. They had underestimated me entirely, assuming that meekness equated to weakness. And yet, beneath the carefully maintained calm, beneath the polite smiles, I had gathered a complete understanding of their hierarchy, their fears and their blind spots. The grandmother's presence lingered in my mind. She had been the only constant observer, the only person who truly saw beyond the polished cruelty and calculated smiles. Her quiet approval had given me a lifeline, a subtle assurance that strength could exist quietly, patiently, without drawing attention until the right moment. And in that moment, I realized I didn't just need to survive this family, I needed to master it. Because when the time came, and it would come soon, their arrogance, their assumptions, and their underestimation of me would be their undoing. I lay back, closing my eyes. The emotional exhaustion was real, but it carried a strange clarity. I had endured judgment, insult, and subtle cruelty. I had observed, learned, and understood. And in that understanding lay the blueprint for what was to come. The night stretched long, silent, and heavy, but I slept not out of defeat, but in preparation, preparing for the revelation, the exposure, and the reversal of every assumption they had made about me. By the next time I returned to that table, nothing and no one would be the same. The hallway outside the dining room was silent, bathed in the soft glow of sconces, each casting gentle pools of amber light on the polished wooden floor. I had excused myself again, but this time not for composure or retreat, for clarity. My palms pressed against the smooth console, cold and grounding, as I allowed the tension of the evening to settle in my chest. The grandmother appeared beside me. I hadn't noticed her rise from the table, so quiet, so deliberate, so stealthy that her movement could almost be mistaken for shadow. Her presence was calm, almost imperceptible, yet carried a weight that seemed to bend the air around her. She did not speak immediately, did not offer comfort or explanation. Instead, she placed a folded piece of paper into my hand with gentle precision. "Read it when you are alone," she whispered, her voice barely above the hum of the hallway, but each word resonated like a bell in my chest. I nodded, unsure what to say. She didn't wait for a response. She turned, walking back toward the dining room with the same quiet authority she had displayed all evening. Her steps made no sound on the polished floor, yet I could feel them, like ripples in a pond, echoing in the air around me. Outside the room, the cool night air wrapped around me as I stepped into the driveway. The world felt sharper, cleaner, somehow freer than the suffocating warmth of the dining room. In my hand, the folded paper felt heavier than it looked. A small object, yet it carried the weight of revelation. The drive home was silent, tension coiling in my chest like a living thing. My fiance sat beside me, unusually quiet, not contemplative, not nervous, just still. Finally, after what felt like hours, he spoke. "You embarrassed me," he muttered, voice low, defensive. "They were just trying to understand you." I turned my gaze from the window, feeling the sting of his words. "I didn't lie," I replied, soft but firm, letting each word carry measured calm. "I simply allowed the truth to exist." He exhaled sharply, jaw tightening, fingers clenching the steering wheel. His silence returned after that, heavier than words could convey. At home, I closed the door behind me and sank into the quiet of the living room. The paper in my hand waited. I unfolded it carefully, as though it were a map to something I could scarcely comprehend. It was neither a phone number nor advice, at least not in the conventional sense. The words, written in precise, deliberate handwriting, were simple, yet each carried an almost explosive clarity. Never marry into a family that tests your worth before knowing your heart. Beneath it a name, her name, the grandmother's maiden name. Recognition struck me immediately, a spark igniting in my chest. My mind raced through the fragments I had observed that night. Her subtle authority, the quiet weight she carried in a room dominated by arrogance, her knowledge, patience, and calm observation. I opened my laptop, fingers trembling as though the paper itself had electrified them. 5 minutes of searching confirmed it. She wasn't just a figurehead. She was the source, the origin of wealth, influence, and control in the family. Her fortune, her properties, her power, everything the others so fiercely guarded, so carefully curated, came from her. And suddenly, the grandmother's subtle movements, her careful observation, her patient silence, all fell into place. She hadn't been judging me. She had been waiting to see who I was, what I would endure, and how I would respond. The realization was staggering. She had been testing them, not me. She had been choosing me as someone worthy of recognition, someone who could understand the unseen power that truly governed the family. I felt a surge of clarity, strength, and calm determination. The family's tests, their veiled insults, their silent evaluations, they had underestimated me entirely. And I had learned everything I needed to learn in one evening. The grandmother's words echoed in my mind. Never marry into a family that tests your worth before knowing your heart. The weight of the evening, the subtle cruelty, the quiet judgment, and the lessons absorbed, all converged into a single, undeniable truth. Power was not always visible. Authority did not always speak. Control was exercised in quiet, subtle ways, often unrecognized until it was too late. And now I understood where the true power lay in that family. Not in the father, not in the mother, not in the sister. It lay in her patient, observing, subtle, and undeniably strong. I allowed myself a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. I had survived the tests. I had observed the hierarchy. I had cataloged their weaknesses and patterns. And I had gained an ally of immeasurable strength in the grandmother. That night, sleep eluded me, not from fear, but from the rush of understanding. I lay awake, turning the events of the evening over in my mind, replaying gestures, words, and glances. I realized that the grandmother's subtle guidance had given me something far more valuable than advice or warning: perspective. I could now see clearly the cracks in the family's armor, the vulnerabilities hidden beneath polished manners and social pretenses. I could see the leverage, the moments where perception outweighed reality, and the places where the assumptions of control were utterly flawed. By the next encounter, I would act with a precision and awareness they could never anticipate. And the grandmother, quiet as she had always been, would know I had understood, that I had accepted the responsibility that came with awareness. Because knowledge, patience, and clarity, these were far more powerful than wealth or privilege. And with them, I was ready. That night, alone in the quiet of my home, I allowed myself a rare moment of satisfaction. The family's invisible game had been revealed to me. I had endured, observed, and understood. And I would not be overlooked. Not now, not ever. The paper rested on my desk, a small rectangle of folded authority. The grandmother's quiet choice had shifted the balance of power. And I felt it, felt the weight and potential of the truth in my hands. Tomorrow, the game would continue. But now, I was no longer a passive participant. I had insight, patience, and strategy. I had knowledge of the hidden dynamics. And the grandmother's subtle blessing gave me permission to act with confidence. This was no longer a test of humility. This was preparation for the revelation to come, a reckoning that would leave no assumption unchallenged, no arrogance unpunished, and no misjudgment unexposed. The next week arrived with a kind of quiet tension that seemed to hum in the air. I returned to the family home, still wearing the same coat, still speaking softly, still playing the role of the poor, naive girl, but beneath that carefully crafted exterior, I was entirely different, sharp, aware, prepared. Every smile, every nod, every polite word was a calculation, a chess move in a game they had yet to understand. Dinner began as it always did, polite and measured, each person taking their designated role at the table. But I had noticed the subtle signs immediately. His sister, usually so composed, tapped her nails faster than usual against the rim of her glass. His mother's hands twitched, adjusting the tablecloth nervously. Even his father, the supposed patriarch, leaned slightly forward, curiosity and unease flickering across his face. The first subtle reveal came in conversation. "Oh, you help small schools?" his sister asked, her tone sweet but with an edge, clearly trying to sound casual while probing for a lack of significance. "Yes," I said softly, voice gentle, eyes steady. "We try to make a difference where it counts." Her smile faltered. A flicker of recognition passed across her face, quickly masked, her nails stilled. The mother's fingers, ever precise and controlled, pressed lightly on the table, almost instinctively. Even the father's hand, hovering over his wineglass, paused midair. The grandmother's eyes flicked toward me, subtle and approving, a slight nod. almost imperceptible, conveyed more meaning than any words could. She had been watching, patient and deliberate, waiting for the moment when I would reveal my quiet strength. I continued, carefully layering the subtle exposure. Casual mentions of philanthropic initiatives, whispered anecdotes about charity programs, quiet references to initiatives that moved millions of dollars, all delivered with soft-spoken humility. At first, the family attempted to dismiss it. Polite smiles, nods, subtle attempts to redirect conversation, to reassert control, but the truth had been planted, like a seed that grows silently beneath the soil before bursting into bloom. I watched as the sister's eyes widened fractionally. The mother's lips pressed into a thin line, the father's jaw tightened imperceptibly, and the grandmother, she leaned slightly forward, her expression one of quiet satisfaction, as though confirming that the seeds had taken root. The air shifted further when I casually mentioned a foundation I managed, not as a boast, but as a matter-of-fact truth, a foundation that moved millions, influenced thousands, and operated with precision far beyond their imagination. They didn't laugh, they didn't smile. Their polite facades faltered, their carefully maintained composure cracked, and I let it linger. I allowed them to realize, without my adding emphasis, that the poor, naive girl had far more power, far more influence, and far more autonomy than any of them had accounted for. Impressive, his sister said softly, but the edge in her tone betrayed tension. She was recalculating everything she thought she knew about me. Every assumption she had held now seemed fragile. The mother's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water. The father's eyes darted briefly to mine, a flicker of discomfort crossing his normally composed features. And the fiance? He shifted, unable to find footing in the sudden revelation of the woman he thought he knew. I observed, silently savoring the moment, knowing exactly what was happening. The power dynamic had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. They had tested me, assumed their dominance, underestimated my patience and strategy, and now the scales were tipping. The grandmother's nod, almost imperceptible, was a signal, approval, recognition, a quiet alliance in the background, the subtle acknowledgement that I had passed, not just their tests, but hers as well. She had been waiting for me to reveal my strength, and now I had done so, quietly, deliberately, without fanfare. The family tried to recover. They attempted to reassert control with polite conversation, careful laughter, and the occasional pointed compliment. But it was too late. They could no longer perceive me as harmless, dependent or naive. They had glimpsed the truth. I was powerful, aware, and fully capable of navigating the currents of control and influence they wielded so arrogantly. I allowed a small smile, demure yet confident. My voice remained soft, calm, almost humble, but each word carried weight. Each gesture, each nod, each carefully timed laugh underscored the reality that they had underestimated me. The grandmother caught my eye. A slight, almost imperceptible wink, subtle but unmistakable. Approval, acknowledgement, perhaps even pride. She had orchestrated this silently, guiding me to reveal what they could not see, teaching me patience, strategy, and the power of quiet dominance. Conversation turned to future plans, inheritance, and social obligations, all topics previously intended to intimidate me. But now, with knowledge, preparation, and the grandmother's subtle backing, I could navigate them effortlessly. Each question, each comment, each probing glance was answered calmly, measuredly, with a softness that belied strategic precision. By the end of the evening, the table had shifted. Polite facades remained, but tension lingered like a shadow. Every glance, every soft comment, every deliberate gesture from them now carried the weight of recognition that the girl they had assumed they controlled had revealed her power. The fiancé sat beside me, jaw tight, silence thick, unable to reconcile the naive figure he believed he knew with the woman who had quietly dismantled every assumption. And the grandmother, she smiled softly, a single, quiet acknowledgement that everything had unfolded exactly as she had intended. She had waited, observed, and guided from the shadows. And now the balance had shifted. I left the table that night with calm composure, outwardly unchanged, but inwardly armed with knowledge, clarity, and strategy. The family's assumptions had been challenged, their control subtly undermined, and I had emerged stronger, wiser, and prepared for the final phase. Because the next step, the ending, the revelation, the ultimate assertion of power was coming, and they would not see it until it was too late. The morning sunlight fell softly through the curtains, illuminating the room with a calm, almost deceptive serenity. I dressed quietly, each movement deliberate, controlled, the final act of preparation before the culmination of everything I had endured, observed, and mastered. Today would not be like the nights before. Today, the masks would fall, and the truth would be undeniable. I arrived at the family home with the same modest appearance, the same soft voice, the same demure smile. But underneath, I was no longer the girl they believed they had tested. I carried knowledge, patience, strategy, and the subtle backing of the grandmother, the true architect of power in that household. The first moments of dinner were predictably polite. The table was immaculate, every place setting precise, every glass perfectly aligned. They believed normalcy had returned. The father, the mother, the sister, all assumed the evening would proceed as before. But I had other plans. I began with small gestures, polite acknowledgement, soft conversation, casual compliments, each word measured, each movement unassuming. And then, slowly, deliberately, I began to reveal the subtle power they had ignored, first with conversation, then with insight. I heard about the new foundation initiatives. I said softly, almost as if mentioning a casual observation, "It's impressive how much impact can be achieved quietly, without seeking attention." The mother's hands paused mid-motion. The sister's nails stilled. Even the father, usually so composed, allowed a flicker of surprise to cross his features. They had not anticipated it, the calm, quiet authority in my voice, the depth of knowledge, the precision of insight. They had assumed humility meant weakness. They had assumed naivety meant ignorance. And now they were confronted with the reality. I continued, weaving anecdotes of philanthropy, quietly demonstrating competence, subtly revealing influence without boasting. Each revelation chipped away at the facade they had so carefully constructed. The air shifted, tension thickened. Polite smiles remained, but control had slipped from their hands. The grandmother, observing quietly from her place, allowed a faint, approving nod. Her subtle encouragement had guided me to this point. She had prepared me to reveal strength without aggression, influence without arrogance. The sister leaned forward, curiosity mingled with unease. "You really manage all of this?" she asked, voice soft, tentative. I smiled faintly. "Yes, it's not about being seen, it's about being effective." The words landed like stones in the calm water of their assumptions. The mother's lips pressed together, the father's jaw tightened, and the fiance shifted uneasily, realizing, finally, the depth of the woman he had underestimated. I moved slowly, deliberately, each gesture subtle but commanding. I addressed their expectations, answered their unspoken questions, and exposed their assumptions with precision. Politeness remained my shield, but every word, every glance, every soft laugh carried authority. The grandmother finally spoke, quietly but firmly. "Power is not always visible. Control is not always loud. And those who understand this are not always recognized immediately." Her words were not for them. They were for me, validation, affirmation, and silent instruction. She had chosen her ally wisely. And now the timing was perfect. By the time dessert arrived, the shift was undeniable. The family's polite performance could no longer mask the awareness of my influence. They had tested me, underestimated me, assumed their dominance. And now they were confronted with the very undeniable reality: I was not naive. I was not weak. I was fully capable of seeing, understanding, and acting, quietly, deliberately, decisively. I allowed a small, composed smile, acknowledging the subtle shock and recalibration occurring in the minds around me. My fiancé's eyes met mine, finally registering what he had missed. The girl he thought he knew had grown into someone he could not control, could not predict, and could no longer ignore. The grandmother's quiet satisfaction was evident. Her eyes sparkled with recognition, pride, and the calm assurance that the balance of power had shifted in the correct direction. She had taught me patience, strategy, and the strength of silent authority. Finally, I rose, voice calm, soft, yet unmistakably firm. "Thank you for the dinner," I said. "It has been enlightening." Polite smiles attempted to mask discomfort. The mother's fingers twitched against the table. The sister's nails drummed lightly. The father's jaw remained tight, a silent acknowledgement of recalibration. I turned toward the door, leaving behind the polite pretense, the soft laughter, the thin veneer of control they had relied upon. Every step was deliberate, each movement calculated to convey quiet confidence. At the threshold, I paused, one last glance at the grandmother. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. Approval, recognition, alliance. A silent acknowledgement that the game was won, that the family had been confronted with truth. and that I had emerged not only unscathed, but empowered. I walked out, leaving behind assumptions shattered, arrogance exposed, and authority subtly but irrevocably redefined. Outside, the world seemed sharper, more vivid. The sunlight glinted off the pavement, illuminating the path ahead, one that I would walk with awareness, strategy, and confidence. I had endured, observed, learned, and now acted. The naive girl was gone. What remained was someone fully aware of her power, her agency, and the strength that comes from patience and observation. The family behind me would remember this evening, every subtle revelation, every quiet assertion, every soft word that carried authority. They had underestimated me at every turn, and now they would know the cost of that misjudgment. As I stepped into the light, I allowed myself the smallest, satisfied smile. The game was over. The lesson was learned. And the girl who had appeared naive and powerless had emerged fully in control, quietly, strategically, irresistibly.